You viewers might know she was the 4-year-old girl who was abducted quite recently. It was on the 16th of October. She was taken from a campsite in Western Australia, and she was taken for about 18 days altogether, and she was found, thankfully, unharmed. Hello, cruel world. My name is Dr. Sohom Das. I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist. I assess mentally disordered offenders for a living so that you don't have to. You're about to watch a clip of me being a guest on my boy Shaun Attwood's YouTube channel. Quick shout out to Shaun. And when I was a guest, I discussed a number of cases. Some of these were like high profile cases, many of which I'm sure you've heard of if you're a true crime fan. And I also talked about my own cases, so patients that I personally assessed, acting as an expert witness for criminal court. I anonymise my patients, always change their names, demographic details, out of respect for not just the patients, but more importantly, the victims and their families. So sit back, relax. I hope you enjoy it, and I'll catch you after the clip.
Broadmoor podcast that we did with Dr. Das, and we have had multiple people write in and request that we do a part 2. Now, if you watch part 1, then you're probably aware that these stories, the cases, the people that Dr. Das interacted with are very traumatic situations, people who have done extreme crimes. And we just need to give a disclaimer at the beginning of this video. If you don't have the stomach for that kind of content, then perhaps this isn't the one for you. So this is an educational video. It is based on real life experience and true cases. And we are gonna delve into the minds of the criminally insane. And the first one we're gonna call Jake.
Mr. 𝐨𝐬𝐲𝐜𝐡, yeah.
What happened with Jake?
So Jake was quite an interesting case. He's a man who had post-traumatic stress disorder. So he was a soldier. He worked in Afghanistan. He went through some horrific experiences. He saw a couple of his own team get killed right in front of him. They stepped on a landmine, blew up, died in front of him. So he understandably was really freaked out by this. Developed full-blown PTSD. Just for your viewers, what that is when people go through life-threatening trauma, they re-experience the trauma in the form of flashbacks or nightmares. They have like problems with anxiety, and they have like depression, and they try and avoid those triggers wherever possible. So that was all what was happening for this man, 𝐨𝐸𝐲. And then he unfortunately became an alcoholic. So I think he was self-medicating over the years. And a good while, about 10 years after all of this happened in Afghanistan, he went into a shop, got into an argument with the shopkeeper who was refusing to serve him because he was just drunk. He was just kind of knocking bottles all over the place. And he grabbed a bottle of vodka, smashed it over the store owner. The man was a Sikh, and he used some racial language, just kind of abused him. And my job was to see Jake after he'd been remanded in prison and do an assessment. And what was interesting about this case was that he'd already been seen by a psychiatrist for the defense. And the psychiatrist said it was PTSD, and that basically explained his behavior. And he tried to put forward a defense of not guilty by reason of insanity. And when I assessed Mr. 𝐨𝐸𝐲, from a humanitarian angle, I felt really bad for him and all the experiences he went through, but I wasn't really buying what the defense were pushing because it hadn't been explored properly. So the defense psychiatrist was saying that he was having these flashbacks, but he didn't actually, from the assessment report that I saw, he didn't really dig down and ask him what symptoms he was feeling. So for example, did he actually feel that he was reliving the war at the time? If so, what were the triggers? What were his actual experiences at the time? None of that was explored. Then when I explored it with the defendant, I just felt that actually he was just angry. Like the reason that he lashed out at the shopkeeper was because he wanted booze. He felt kind of humiliated because of this public argument. So I didn't think that there was an argument for him not being criminally responsible, which is what I said in my report.
And had there been any other incidents with this individual?
There had, but none as severe as this. So it had a couple of minor assaults, a couple of arguments, quite public arguments, mostly in the context of being agitated and being drunk. But what it did is it really exposed me to the first time for what I think are cowboy experts. So I work as an expert witness. I'm very objective and honest with my opinion. But I felt in this particular case that the defendant psychiatrist had just given the opinion that the defence wanted to hear and the solicitors wanted to hear to try and get this man off. And that does happen in my world. You do get people that, even though you're supposed to be completely honest and objective and neutral, I think you get people who kind of lean or twist the evidence towards the defence or the prosecution, depending on who's paying them, basically.
So it is very common.
I wouldn't say it's very common, but it's common. Even if it happens a few times, like once every 5-10 cases, that's enough to kind of twist what is fair and what's justice for the victims. Yeah.
Well, it's out of control in America, and it's so common there now. It's called testy lying. And if you look at big cases out there, you've got this expert for the defence, expert for the prosecution, both experts on the same thing, saying diametrically opposed conclusions.
Yeah.
So it's like pantomime.
Yeah, it can be. And I suppose if you ask questions for the defendant in a certain way, you can potentially coach them, right? So you can say, instead of saying, what were your experiences at the time? You can say, were you suffering a flashback? Did it remind you of X, Y, Z? So it's actually not that hard to twist the evidence, but obviously it's completely dishonest.
You got crime labs now in America. Prosecutor calls up and they say, what result do you want? Crime labs have been busted doing that in America.
So
DNA results. What DNA result do you want?
If you pay more, you get the result you want.
Money talks.
Yes.
Yeah, and there's an us versus them mentality. So the prosecutors, the crime lab, the state versus the criminal. Yeah.
Oh dear.
So honesty gets thrown out the window and I think sometimes these people, there's not enough evidence, and they've convinced themselves the person's guilty, so they think it's justified to fudge and get experts in. But often, years later, something comes out to prove that the person's completely innocent. As we've seen, these people are getting off after decades, even on death row. It's staggering.
I suppose what it boils down to is it's the defence's job to try and get the best outcome from their client. So their job is to try and get the client found either not guilty or to have mitigating circumstances. And it's the prosecution's job to do the opposite of that. But the expert, as I said before, should be neutral. So their job shouldn't be to sway justice. It should be just to tell the absolute truth. Yeah. But the truth is a grey kind of area.
Well, I think we've seen that before in the case of Jeremy Bamber with the various experts involved there. They've gradually been discredited over the years.
What do you think about the Bamber case?
I've got mixed feelings about this. When I first researched it, so I did a video on him, it seemed to me that there's quite a lot of evidence to suggest that he was guilty, and that he tried to set up his sister who had schizophrenia, and there were certainly aspects of the case, like for example her smoking cannabis recently and her not taking a medication, which would suggest that she could become symptomatic. But since then I've heard a whole other side of the argument, including some people that approached me at CrimeCon. I'm sure you spoke to them as well.
So now
we interviewed them some time ago, and that case is currently with the Criminal Cases Review Commission, and there are still millions of pages of evidence that haven't been released. It's a very, very strange story, but I don't know whether he is innocent or guilty, but certainly that case was mishandled by the police authorities involved, and he definitely deserves a review of his situation.
Do you two have any opinions on his potential innocence or guilt?
I was definitely swayed by watching your interview because I was present, sat over there, wasn't I?
Yes.
And the interview with these.
Well, there's just so much that doesn't make sense.
It doesn't make sense, and the burying
you can't
of
be in
evidence.
two places at the same time, and if somebody was inside that building moving around, and he was standing outside with the police, then he cannot have been the killer.
Yeah. So what the police are selling, I ain't buying.
Yeah, the police conclusion was that he hadn't done it. The sister had done it, and then they destroyed everything, so there was no evidence. And then when the women went against him, who had this vested interest of inheriting all of his property, and his girlfriend who got $10,000 from the News of the World.
And don't forget
contingent on him being found guilty.
And don't forget the police officer who ended up working as a security guard for the people who eventually inherited.
It's an absolute shambles, isn't it?
Most definitely.
And the other police officer who happened to fall off a ladder before the trial and was dead.
This is the thing, when there's no physical evidence, because in this case there was already a conclusion the physical evidence was destroyed. When there's no physical evidence, it then just becomes completely subjective, doesn't it? And the government always has the most money to put on the best theatre show, versus in America, you see it's mostly poor people, that get arrested for
so going back to the case you mentioned.
Oh yeah,
what was the outcome of
the outcome for Jake?
So he, off the back of my evidence, he got a community order as opposed to a prison sentence. So he had to address his alcohol problems. So he had to go to rehab. He had to meet with a mental health professional on a regular basis. But it's like a contract. So if he broke any of those things, then he would end up in prison. But the last I heard, which is a good few years ago, he was sticking to his order. So
really?
He did just about dodge prison.
Yeah. That's good.
Yeah.
And what about the victim in this? Did he recover from his injuries?
Yeah. I think he needed some stitches at hospital, and I'm sure the whole incident must have been quite traumatic for him for the future. But there was no long-standing damage that I'm aware of.
Did you see all the stitches on 𝐏𝐬𝐲𝐜's head?
Oh, from the fight the other night? Yeah. That was a bit of a bloodbath, wasn't it? Have you seen it?
I saw the footage this morning.
Did you see it?
Yeah.
No.
One of our podcast guests had a bare knuckle fight with another guy.
Oh gosh.
Yeah.
And they sledgehammered the hell out of each other. Both of their faces are just they've both got black eyes and stitches, and but they shook hands at the end of it, and they both put on a good show.
Did they have some sort of beef before then?
Yeah, there was a lot of beef before then. This has squashed it now, hopefully.
Good way to squash it.
Yeah. All right, so Jake's behaving himself. Victim has recovered. It looks like a good conclusion to that then.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I think it's more just. I think had the CPS, that's who instructed me, had they not asked for my report, I think the judge would have just taken what the first psychiatrist said at face value, and I don't think that would have been justice for the victim.
Yeah.
And possibly even as importantly, Jake wouldn't have got rehabilitation. He wouldn't have got into the system.
So what is the story with Cleo Smith?
So Cleo Smith, you viewers might know, she was the 4-year-old girl who was abducted quite recently. It was on the 16th of October. She was taken from a campsite in Western Australia, and she was taken for about 18 days altogether, and she was found, thankfully, unharmed. So I researched this a bit because I made a video on my channel, and what interests me, there's two aspects. First of all, the psychological consequences of being kidnapped. So I think for her, because she was so young, and because as far as we know she wasn't mistreated, touch wood, it's not going to be too permanent or too serious. But a lot of people who do suffer from being kidnapped, especially if there's some sort of physical or sexual assault, it's horrible. It's like from depression to anxiety to PTSD that we were talking about. They often become quite withdrawn. They stop socializing, lack energy, and it takes months, if not years, for people to recover. And the other aspect that interested me was the perpetrator. So this is a man called Terence Kelly. So I don't know if you know anything about him, but I've got a psychiatric theory if you want to hear it.
Yes.
So there's not that much information about him yet, and I'm sure there will be in the coming weeks and months during his trial. But we do know that he was a bit of a loner. He was odd, I think is fair to say. So he had this obsession with dolls. So when the police raided his house, he had all these Bratz, which
creepy
are brand,
dolls.
Yeah, creepy dolls and Disney dolls, head to floor to ceiling.
Were they a substitute for having no friends?
Yeah. So he was a complete loner, didn't have any friends. He was quite sort of polite and gentle. He wasn't antisocial in any way. He did a couple of other bizarre things. So he was on social media, on Facebook, having taken his dolls out for a drive. He would take pictures of the dolls and said,
how big are these dolls?
Bratz dolls, they're quite...
Okay.
Yeah.
So my theory is this. I think that he's probably got undiagnosed schizoid personality disorder. So this is quite a rare diagnosis. Not that many people have it. And it's even rarer in the people I assess in the offender population because it generally doesn't lead to violence. And schizoid personality disorder is when somebody is completely disconnected from society. So they don't have friends. They don't care about other people's criticism or praise, so that they don't really want to be part of society. They tend to have this internalized fantasy world So I think he's probably got this fantasy world with these dolls where they're, you know, live people and his friends. They lack kind of humour or drive. So all of these things, from what I know, describe Terence Kelly. And you have to wonder what his motivations were for taking this young girl, Cleo. And obviously for the majority of people that would take a child, it would be related to, you know, sexual desires or to a lust for violence. But as far as we're aware, she was unharmed. And he had her for 18 days. So you'd think that if he was going to do something, he would have done it within that time. So I think my theory is that she was part of his fantasy world. So he saw her like a living doll that he could kind of own indefinitely. But luckily the authorities kind of intervened.
Could you just repeat what your diagnosis on him was? A schizoid what?
Schizoid personality disorder, yeah. So
that's different from schizophrenia?
Yeah. So it's a common misconception because they sound so similar. So schizophrenia is a tendency to become psychotic. Periods of psychosis is when you're outside of reality. So typically hearing voices or suffering like paranoid delusions where you think people are after you or trying to kill you. So that is a mental illness, whereas schizoid personality disorder is a personality disorder. So that's a character flaw that's permanent. It's always there. So I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you find that all interesting. If you're interested in true crime and mental illness or the crossover between the two, then you have to check out the other videos on my channel, A Psych for Sore Minds. I cover a whole range, a smorgasbord of cases and topics, similar to what I did on Shaun's channel, but a few different ones. Again, you've probably heard of some of them. And I also talk about more general issues. So I talk about individual diagnoses, I talk about working with psychopaths, I talk about mental illness and gangs, I talk about, what else? Oh yeah, polygraphs, lie detectors, how to beat one. I talk about nature versus nurture when it comes to murdering and violence. I talk about the psychoanalysis of stalking, I talk about domestic violence. What I'm trying to say is that there's something for everybody on my channel. Go check it out, go subscribe, and hit me up in the comments section. Enjoy. Oh, and also I've almost forgot myself to say, please do not forget, I love you.